Despite numerous deficiencies exhibited by the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia in its first pitched battle at Beaver Dam Creek and Mechanicsville on June 26, General Robert E. Lee's offensive strategy is working. Stonewall Jackson's arrival northeast of Richmond has rendered the Federal position north of the Chickahominy River untenable. Unknown to Lee, McClellan has already decided to abandon his vulnerable base at White House Landing in favor of one located south of the Chickahominy. As reports of Jackson's arrival come into McClellan's headquarters on the night of June 26, McClellan knows he has to act or Porter's 5th Corps would be swallowed whole, rolling out an offensive action on either side of the river, much to the chagrin of subordinates who urged him to exploit Porter's victory at Beaver Dam Creek, and imagining overwhelming forces wherever he looks. Major General McClellan opts to abandon his offensive and retreat, not back down the Virginia Peninsula the way he had originally came, but due south to the nearest haven, the James River. General McClellan terms his retreat a change of base that would save his Army of the Potomac from certain destruction. Brigadier General Porter is told to fall back to a new defensive position near Gaine's Mill that would cover the river crossings and hold the Confederates at bay. Although McClellan is already defeated, his army still has plenty of fight left in it. At 3 a.m. on June 27th, Brigadier General George A. McCall, whose 3 infantry brigades of his Pennsylvania Reserves Division had fought and won the Battle of Mechanicsville, get the order to withdraw from the Beaver Dam Creek line. Rear guards supported by artillery screened the movement, holding the creek crossings until after sunrise, when rebel skirmishers advance as soon as it is light enough to see, except for 2 companies of the 13th Pennsylvania Reserves, who do not get the order and are captured. All the Union men and guns make good the 3-mile withdrawal to a new position beyond Bosun's Creek, which also is referred to as a swamp. Generals want to sleep easy at night knowing that their men will be protected during their slumber. This goes for anybody on the internet with their personal information. If you want to keep your data protected, then you should get NordVPN. You can easily get NordVPN today by using my special coupon link nordvpn.com/Warhawk down in the description. After clicking on the link, you might ask, what does NordVPN have to offer? NordVPN will keep your data safe online. They will keep your information protected and give you a smooth online experience. You also won't miss your favorite content, such as yours truly. If you're ever traveling abroad and for some unknown reason, the country you're visiting blocks our content, NordVPN will give you the ability to change your virtual location so you can consume all the Warhawk content that your heart desires. NordVPN allows you to connect up to 6 devices to ensure you are protected however or wherever you access the internet, and while doing that, offers amazing speeds. NordVPN has the fastest speeds out of any VPN on the market. Finally, NordVPN offers 5,400 servers in over 60 different countries, so you have plenty of places to choose from when looking for the right content to access. All this and more when you get NordVPN, where you can get a big discount by using the link nordvpn.com/Warhawk down in the description. Shifting brigades so fresh troops could attack at dawn, Lee arrives in Mechanicsville determined to achieve everything on June 27th that was not accomplished on June 26. When it becomes obvious that the enemy is falling back, Lee has A.P. Hill push his light division across Beaver Dam Creek. The Confederate commander orders Major Generals Magruder and Ugey to hold the Richmond works at the point of the bayonet if necessary. One of Lee's first moves that morning is to send an aide to guide Jackson south from Hunley's Corner to join the main Confederate body. Lee meets Jackson and A.P. Hill at 10 a.m. and explains his plan to envelop the enemy. Jackson would march northeastward on Cold Harbor Road across the headwaters of Powhite Creek to Old Cold Harbor, where he'd be joined by D.H. Hill. Major General Hill is already in motion, conducting his own wider turning movement on the Old Church Road farther south. When joined, D.H. Hill and Jackson would command 14 of the Army's 26 infantry brigades. On the Confederate right, Major General Longstreet would move his division down the river road along the bluffs overlooking the Chickahominy River in support of A.P. Hill's advance in the center toward Powhite Creek and Gaine's Mill. Unlike the previous day, A.P. Hill has orders to attack the Federals wherever he finds them. He puts Brigadier General Maxcy Gregg's brigade of well-rested South Carolinians, which had been held in reserve the previous day, at the front of his light division. By mid-morning, Brigadier General Porter has his reinforced 5th Corps on the plateau behind Bosun's Creek. which encloses a horseshoe-shaped position of great natural strength. The oval-shaped plateau is about 2 miles wide and a mile deep, with its long outer side facing north. The Watt, McGehee, and Adams families each have homes on the plateau, and the cleared land around these structures furnishes superb fields of fire for defenders. The highest elevation is known locally as Turkey Hill, though the day's battle would take its name from a site a mile away, the home and gristmill of Dr. William Gaines. The doctor is the area's largest landowner and is renowned for support of the rebellion. Union troops had been camped on his land for several months and had, over his protest, buried a number of their fever-stricken dead on the property. Gaines has defiantly announced he would dig up the bodies and feed them to his hogs after the Yankees were driven away. Rising at the northeast corner of the plateau and curving around its northern and western sides before emptying into the Chickahominy River, Bosun's Creek is a sluggish little stream, its banks and bottomlands heavily overgrown with trees and underbrush. The ground to the north and west is largely open and under cultivation and sloped down to the swampy bottomland. Porter arranges his corps in a crescent-shaped line almost 2 miles long facing north and west. Brigadier General George W. Morrell's 1st Division covers the left flank on Turkey Hill, and Brigadier General George Sykes' 2nd Division of mostly U.S. Army regulars holds the right flank. Morrell's position is nearly impregnable. The Yankees are posted in a first line on the eastern edge of the bottomland and in a second line halfway up the hillside. McCall's Pennsylvania Reserves Division is deployed in a third line along the crest of the plateau as a reserve. 2 companies of Colonel Hiram Berdane's 1st U.S. sharpshooters are deployed in the first line. The infantrymen in all 3 lines are sheltered behind hurley-fashioned earthworks of logs, fence rails, and dirt. Believing he is not strong enough to extend his line back to the Chickahominy River on his right, Porter relies on the boggy, broken ground there to discourage a turning movement. Porter has 96 guns which width to support his infantry. The guns are positioned along the third line of works or in reserve on the plateau. Adding additional firepower are 3 batteries of long-range guns on the south bank of the Chickahominy, where they could assist Morrell's division. Brigadier General Philip St. George Cooke posts 4 companies of the 5th U.S. Cavalry Regiment under Captain Charles J. Whiting on the far left, covering the ground between Morrell's division and the river. As troops of A.P. Hill's Light Division advance toward the enemy's picket line beyond Powhite Creek, the day's first contact takes place 3 miles away, entirely unknown to General Lee, after men of D.H. Hill's division arrive at Old Cold Harbor well ahead of Jackson. Old Cold Harbor is a nondescript crossroads hamlet. Another small village, New Cold Harbor, is situated a mile and a half to the west. When D.H. Hill pushes Garland's brigade and G.B. Anderson's brigade down the road towards the Chickahominy River from Old Cold Harbor, his skirmishers are hit by sharp musket fire from behind a stream to their front and artillery fire from the slope beyond. Captain J.W. Bondurant's Alabama battery of the Jeff Davis artillery is hurried forward to suppress this fire and is bombarded so severely by rifle guns from the high ground to the east, which are manned by the U.S. Army regulars from Sykes' 2nd Division, that is quickly withdrawn. Hill realizes he has met far heavier resistance than is expected and also seems to be facing the enemy's front rather than his flank. The stream behind which the Union infantry shelters is not shown on Hill's map, and therefore he wisely decides to wait Jackson's arrival. This action takes place a little after noon, but Lee learns nothing of it or the enemy's position. Normally, the sound of artillery at that distance would be heard, but on that hot and sultry day there are so-called acoustic shadows. These heavy pockets of dense, moist air scattered across the field frequently muffles the sounds of battle. In their first action of the war, Maxcy Gregg and his men push down the Telegraph Road and reach Powhite Creek at Gaine's Mill around noon. Told to expect a fight there, the men of Gregg's brigade meet only desultory fire and continue on across the creek to New Cold Harbor, moving at the double quick down a slope towards a wooded area that borders yet another swampy body of water. The Battle of Gaine's Mill, also known in some northern accounts as the Battle of Chickahominy River, erupts in earnest about 2:30 p.m. on Friday, June 27, 1862. From across the swamp comes withering musket fire, joined by shell and solid shot from Union artillery guns on the high ground, that halts Gregg's brigade and drives his troops back in confusion. After Gregg rallies his shaken regiments and reports back to A.P. Hill that he has made contact with the enemy, Hill and Lee ride up for a look. Lee quickly realizes the Federals have taken their stand not behind Powhite Creek as he expects, but in a far more imposing position behind a creek that does not appear on his maps. Furthermore, the enemy is facing north as well as west and appears to be in great force. Believing Jackson and D.H. Hill would soon be adding their weight to the contest, Lee tells Gregg to hold his position until the rest of the division comes up to renew the assault. After the brigades of Brigadier Generals Lawrence O'Brien Branch, Dorsey Pender, Joseph R. Anderson, Charles Field, and James Archer form on Gregg's right, the Confederate battle line stretches for almost a mile. Once again, the attackers failed to mass their guns for concentrated fire, and both the gunners and infantrymen would suffer as a result. Most of A.P. Hill's men would have at least a quarter of a mile of open ground to cross before they reached Bosun's Creek. From his command post at the Watt House on Turkey Hill, Porter observes Hill's brigades deploying for battle and rising dust clouds off to his left along the river road, and signals a request for reinforcements to Army headquarters. Brigadier General Henry W. Slocum's 1st Division of 6th Corps has been designated to serve as reinforcements if necessary. McClellan, coordinating his army's efforts by telegraph from his headquarters at the Trent House south of the river, and thus not personally directing any of the actual fighting, relays a request to 6th Corps headquarters, and Slocum's division tramps across the river at Alexander's Bridge. Major General A.P. Hill orders his 12,000-man light division to advance at 2:30 p.m. Brigadier General George Morrell's 1st Division numbers 1,000 fewer men than A.P. Hill's, but with a part of Sykes' 2nd Division also engaged, the defenders there have a small advantage in numbers. They also hold a considerable advantage in artillery. They have 3 batteries: Battery A, 2nd U.S. Artillery, Battery I, 5th U.S. Artillery, and the guns of the combined batteries L and M, 3rd U.S. Artillery, posted on the plateau's lower slopes to thwart Hill's attack, in addition to those packed tightly on the crest. The Confederate gunners make little impression on this formidable array. When Captain D.G. McIntosh's South Carolina battery of the PD Artillery move onto the field, dust and smoke so obscure the swamp and surrounding hills that McIntosh can't tell friend from foe and ceases firing after 3 rounds. The attackers of Gregg's brigade, after forcing a lodgment in the center of the Union line where the divisions of Morrell and Sykes meet, are soon engaged in fierce fighting. Colonel John F. Marshall's 1st South Carolina Rifles Regiment charges with fixed bayonets against batteries L and M, 3rd U.S. Artillery, and clash with its supporting infantry, Dury Zuob's the 5th New York and Colonel Gouverneur K. Warren's 3rd Brigade, and after hand-to-hand fighting are forced back with the loss of 309 men killed or wounded. The rest of Gregg's brigade fares a little better. Branch's brigade, which like Gregg's had not seen action the previous day, is badly battered during the 2-hour assault and loses 401 men. Berdane's sharpshooters, in particular, contribute to the heavy toll. Posted as skirmishers, they move from tree to tree along the swamp's eastern edge, feeding cartridges into their Sharps breech-loading rifles and firing from ranges as short as 40 yards. None of Hill's brigades except Gregg's gain even a toehold beyond Bosun's Creek. J.R. Anderson's brigade launches 3 spirited but unsuccessful charges, while Field's brigade becomes so entangled in the swampy undergrowth that his second line pours volleys of friendly fire into the men in the first rank, forcing Colonel Robert M. Mayo of the 47th Virginia to order his men to fall flat to avoid fire coming from both front and back. In 2 hours, A.P. Hill's light division suffers more than 2,000 casualties while fighting unsupported. Captain William Biddle of General McClellan's staff arrives at Turkey Hill about this time and finds Brigadier General Porter calmly sitting atop his horse behind a strip of woods overlooking the Union left, while a tide of wounded men stream past and shells explode all around. A staff officer asks him if he has a message for headquarters. "You can see for yourself, Captain," says Porter. "We're holding them, but it's getting hotter and hotter." At that moment, the vanguard of Slocum's 1st Division of 6th Corps arrives from the river crossing, raising Porter's numbers to 36,400, and he rides off to plug reinforcements into the line. In the meantime, Stonewall Jackson is struggling to bring his forces to bear where Lee wants them. He has obtained a guide that morning after meeting with Lee, but neglects to offer precise direction as to how he wants to reach Old Cold Harbor. The guide takes the shortest and most direct route, one that leads past Gaine's mill. When Jackson realizes he is not arriving on the enemy's right flank as Lee wants, he orders the column to turn around and countermarch to Cold Harbor Road, delaying the Valley forces' arrival on the field for almost 2 hours. Major General Richard S. Ewell, in Jackson's van, is the first to reach Old Cold Harbor, where he finds Lee's aide, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Taylor, anxiously awaiting him. Worried Porter would mount a counterattack against A.P. Hill's battered division, Lee had dispatched Taylor to find any of Jackson's units and get them into battle as soon as possible. At the same time, Lee tells Major General Longstreet on the right to make at least a diversion in support of A.P. Hill. It is almost 4 p.m. when Lee meets Ewell on Telegraph Road and tells him to attack with his 3 brigades against the Union center, where Gregg and Branch have been beaten back. Lee also sends one of Ewell's aides to locate the rest of Jackson's command and get them to the field as well. Ewell sends in his lead brigade, the Louisiana Tigers, now commanded by the 6th Louisiana's Colonel Isaac G. Seymour, in the absence of the recently promoted Richard Taylor. Without waiting for the rest of his division, forming the Louisiana Brigade into a line of battle with the 6th Louisiana on the extreme right and the 9th Louisiana on the far left, with the 1st Louisiana Special Battalion and the 7th and 8th Louisiana forming the brigade center, Seymour's Tigers advance under a heavy fire of musketry from John Martindale's 1st Brigade of Morrell's division. During the assault, Colonel Seymour is killed while leading his battle lines into the fray. His troops quickly become confused in the boggy thickets of the creek. Command devolves to Major Robideau Wheat, the renowned commander of the 1st Louisiana Special Battalion, who is mortally wounded leading an assault with his battalion. The Tigers waver and then flee to the rear. Ewell's next brigade under Brigadier General Isaac Trimble attacks in piecemeal fashion with just 2 of his regiments, the 15th Alabama and 21st Georgia. "Boys, you are mighty good, but that's hell in there," a retreating Louisiana warns them as both regiments charge into murderous rifle and cannon fire without hesitation. Neither is able to advance beyond the western edge of the bottomland. The Union line holds against these repeated attacks, but each takes a toll. Since their midday skirmish near Gaine's Mill, the Irishmen of the 9th Massachusetts have repulsed consecutive attacks by Branch, Pender, and Trimble, and are out of ammunition. The nearby Zouaves of the 5th New York, after losing a third of their number in succession of charges and countercharges, is sent to the rear for rest and resupply. As Porter moves units from McCall's Pennsylvania Reserves Division into the hardest hit parts of his line, the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves advance with fixed bayonets to relieve the 9th Massachusetts. "We chased them across a field into some woods, but then they got reinforcements and we had to fall back," wrote Corporal Adam Bryant of the regiment. "3 times we reformed our lines and charged them, but could not get them out of the woods. More Slocum's troops are arriving at this point, inserted like McCall's into the lines where they are most needed." Confederate President Jefferson Davis and his entourage are observing the fighting from high ground 1 mile behind the front, but can see little of the fighting in the tangled bottomland. On the extreme Confederate right, Longstreet orders the 2,000 men of Brigadier General George E. Pickett's brigade to attack the Union position behind Bosun's Creek to assist A.P. Hill's hard-pressed division. The Virginians march downhill and disappear into the thickets near the water's edge. Concentrated artillery fire from the crest of Turkey Hill and the south bank of the Chickahominy pummel Pickett's Virginians. During the attack, which lasts from 4 to 4:30 p.m., Brigadier General Pickett is wounded, shot off his horse while leading the assault, but he continues to move forward with his men while leading his horse on foot. A second assault by Pickett's brigade is led by Colonel Eppa Hunton of the 8th Virginia. Hunton's 8th Virginia is the only regiment of Pickett's brigade that succeeds in establishing a breakthrough in the Union lines across Bosun's Creek, but it is unexploited, so no further ground is made in Hunton's sector. Longstreet learns from walking wounded of the attack's failure. Old Pete quickly realizes that it would take the entire army attacking in concert to dislodge the enemy from the hill. Though the attacks of A.P. Hill, Ewell, and Longstreet have been repulsed, Porter is growing more anxious by the minute. By 5 p.m., his men are exhausted, dehydrated, low on ammunition, and their weapons foul. "I'm pressed hard, very hard," he informs headquarters. "About every regiment I have has been in action. and unless reinforced, I am afraid I shall be driven from my position." Having made no contingency plans for such a situation, McClellan sends no immediate reinforcements, but instead merely asks his subordinates if they have any troops to spare. McClellan finally dispatches 2 brigades of Brigadier General Edwin Sumner's 2nd Corps, but due to their location, it would be almost 3 hours before they arrive. Jackson finally arrives at Old Cold Harbor and, at last cognizant of the situation and the enemy's dispositions, begins trying to get his remaining forces into the fray. These are the divisions of Brigadier Generals William H.C. Whiting and Charles Winder. At this point stretch out for several miles along Cold Harbor Road. Rather than sending his ailing chief of staff, Major Robert Dabney, to guide these units into position, Jackson gives hurried, complicated verbal orders to another aide, his quartermaster, Major John Harmon. The 2 fresh divisions are to move into line in echelon between D.H. Hill and Ewell. If that fails, they are to move towards the sound of the heaviest firing. Knowing little of tactics, Harmon becomes hopelessly confused when he attempts to relay Jackson's instructions to Whiting and Winder, after which the puzzled generals remain stationary for another precious hour. As the roar of gunfire intensifies all along the front, Major Dabney realizes what has taken place and rides over to convey the correct orders. One after another, 6 more Confederate brigades finally begin moving into line. Some of the brigades have 2 miles to march and others encounter further confusion when they near the front, but with the daylight beginning to fade, overriding everything else is a sense of urgency. After Jackson meets briefly with Lee on Telegraph Road, he rides back to his units and dispatches couriers to his 2 division commanders. "Tell them this affair must hang in suspense no longer," says Jackson. "Sweep the field with the bayonet." But getting these scattered units into position in the woods and marshes is a painfully slow and difficult process. As a result, 2 of Winder's brigades end up in the reserve behind Longstreet's division, on the far right, a mile from the rest of Winder's men. Whiting commands the brigades of John Bell Hood and Colonel Evander Law. As he marches the 2 brigades towards the sound of the heaviest firing, Whiting has allowed them to drift to the right. They go into action on Longstreet's left, under that officer's direction. It is almost 7 p.m. and the setting sun appears a dull red to the soldiers through the haze of smoke and dust. With A.P. Hill's light division and part of Ewell's division too exhausted for further fighting, and one of Longstreet's brigades allocated to the reserve, Lee deploys 16 brigades totaling 32,100 into line for the final attack. The battle line stretches in a great arc for 2 miles. On the right, the soldiers face east, and on the left they face south. With McCall's and Slocum's divisions fully engaged, Porter's strength is approximately 34,000 men, even though many of the men in the frontline divisions of Morrell and Sykes are worn out after hours of heavy fighting. Moreover, a number of McCall's and Slocum's regiments have been put into line haphazardly, which is apt to lead to significant confusion as the attack goes forward. After Lee orders his entire line forward, the climax of the battle at Gaine's Mill turns into a confused melee. D.H. Hill faces a daunting task on the Confederate left. The slope to the crest of the hill is 400 yards long. The stretch of the hillside is entirely open, and the Federals have placed a battery near the McGehee house to contest any advance with enfilading fire. The brigades of D.H. Hill's division go in and quickly become entangled in the swamp, emerging from the woods and marshes piled one behind the other. 2 regiments, the 2nd and 4th North Carolina, suffers heavy casualties in a vain effort to seize the battery's guns. Struggling mightily towards the crest of the hill, the bulk of D.H. Hill's division engage in savage fighting with Sykes' regulars in an orchard near the McGehee house that becomes a bloody battlefield. Every post, bush, and tree now covers a man who's blazing away as fast he can, wrote Sergeant Thomas Evans of the 12th U.S. Infantry Regiment. Column after column of the enemy melts away like snow, but is quickly reformed and again rushes on. Successive waves of Confederates rush the Yankee line. Brigadier General Alexander Lawton's 3,600-man brigade eagerly advances into the first fight of the war against the Union center. The Stonewall Brigade of Winder's division pushes into line on Lawton's left next to D.H. Hill, joined by a fresh brigade from Ewell's division and Trimble's reformed brigade. On the Confederate right, Longstreet's division faces the most difficult terrain and the heaviest cannon fire of any attacking unit. His men also have to cross almost a quarter mile of open ground to reach the swamp and the first line of enemy works. Up to the crest of the hill we went at a double quick, but when we came into view on top of the ridge, we met such a perfect storm of lead right in our faces that the whole brigade literally staggered backwards several paces as though pushed by a tornado, wrote Corporal Edmund Patterson of the 9th Alabama. Whiting's 2-brigade division, which numbers fewer than 8,000 men, moves into position and constitutes what amounts to the left wing of Longstreet's assault. Hood's Texas Brigade comprises the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas, 18th Georgia, and Hampton, South Carolina Legion. After observing the fierce resistance offered by well-posted Union defenders, Whiting realizes that if the attack is to succeed, then Law's and Hood's brigades would have to advance without pausing to fire, cover the open ground down to the swamp as swiftly as possible without losing order, and punch through the Yankee line. As he moves his 5 regiments into line on Law's left, Hood notices a gap between Law and Longstreet and therefore splits his command, marching the 4th Texas into the gap. For some unknown reason, several companies of the 18th Georgia attached themselves to the 4th Texas as well. Because of these circumstances, Hood would send his Texas Brigade forward on both flanks of Law's brigade. Ignoring the jurisdiction of the 4th Texas's commander, Colonel John Marshall, Hood assumes personal command of his old regiment. Marshall is killed just minutes into the advance. With Hood leading the advance on foot, more than 500 men of the 4th Texas and 18th Georgia step off. The field to the front is littered with dead and wounded comrades, smashed artillery caissons and carriages, stricken horses, and broken ammunition wagons. Law's and Longstreet's men keep pace alongside. They hold their fire and try to make as little noise as possible, as the fire from the massed batteries on Turkey Hill tear holes in the long gray line. The number of dead and wounded mount rapidly. Hood seems to be everywhere at once. He urges his men forward, shouts for them to close on the colors, and orders them to continue to hold their fire. As the range closes to 300 yards, fire from Berdan's sharpshooters and Brigadier Generals John Martindale's and Charles Griffin's frontline troops exacts a horrendous toll. Hood's men fall by the score, but the survivors close ranks and push on. About 150 yards from the swamp, Hood's companies pass through a line of Confederates who are hugging the ground and ignoring the entreaties of their young lieutenants to advance. Disregarding the pleas of these demoralized men to turn back, Hood's troops reach the top of a ridge that leads down to the swamp, the ridge marking the farthest advance of A.P. Hill's men. As Hood's soldiers push over the rise and start down the slope towards the swamp, sheets of flame erupt from the Union works to their front. The fire of the enemy was poured into us with increasing fury, cutting down our ranks like wheat in a harvest, wrote Private William R. Hamby of the 4th Texas. Law and Hood would lose a total of 1,018 men this day, most of them during the sprint to the water's edge. When they are within 100 yards of the swamp, the order goes out to fix bayonets while on the move and advance at the double quick. They finally hit the swamp and at point-blank range from the first line of Federals raise the rebel yell. Concurrently, off to the right, a half-mile-long line of Longstreet's troops are crashing into the swamp, traversing the water and scrambling up the slope. Porter's numbers there are at least equal to those of the attackers. With even the best infantrymen able to get off no more than 3 rounds a minute, the exhausted defenders cannot fire fast enough to halt the swift advance. The Federals in the first line panic, turn, and flee, and in the rush to the rear block the fire of the troops in the second line, carrying those defenders along with them. As the blue tide surges towards the crest of Turkey Hill, Confederate infantrymen stopped the fire at last. One volley was poured into their backs, and it seemed as if every ball found a victim. So great was the slaughter, wrote a Texan. With a breach finally accomplished in the Federal center, Porter's left and right flanks crumble as Longstreet and Jackson widen the rupture in both directions. On Jackson's left, Ewell and D.H. Hill outflanked Sykes' regulars, forcing them to fall back. At this point, the battlefield contracts rapidly towards the river crossings. Those Union regiments still under firm control, mostly the regulars, withdraw without panicking, halting the fire occasionally before continuing on. Others fall back in disorder. The rebel objective at this point becomes the enemy's artillery on the plateau. As the range closes, Yankee gunners switch to canister rounds, but as their infantry supports begin leaving, the field gunners come under merciless fire as well. After capturing 10 guns from the batteries along the crest, the Confederate attackers turn their attention to a second line of guns in reserve on the plateau and encounter, to their surprise, a Napoleonic-style cavalry charge. Philip St. George Cooke has, without orders, led his command up the hill to support the threatened batteries, and, with sabers drawn, 250 men of the 5th U.S. Cavalry Regiment boldly charged the advancing Confederates. The attack accomplishes nothing but the death of 55 troopers. The victorious Confederates captured 9 more guns and 2 entire Federal regiments, which had become lost in the hasty retreat that followed the Union collapse. Unfortunately for Lee and his generals, there is too little daylight remaining for another concerted Confederate push. Sykes' troops, maintaining their reputation by retiring in good order, join with Sumner's 2 brigades, which have just arrived and includes Brigadier General Thomas Marr's Irish Brigade, to cover the retreat while Porter gets the rest of his army and his reserve artillery across the river in the darkness. Gradually, the fire slackens and then dies away, marking the end of the battle. Near the end of the fighting around Boaston's Creek, Brigadier General John F. Reynolds, in command of McCall's 1st Brigade of Pennsylvania Reserves, is captured after falling asleep from exhaustion over the past 2 days of action. While resting in a spot he deems safe, he becomes unaware that his men are retreating around him, and becomes captured by troops of D.H. Hill's division. An embarrassed Reynolds is confronted by his pre-war colleague, Major General D.H. Hill, who tells him, "Do not feel so bad about your capture, it is the fate of wars." General Lee sends a message to Jefferson Davis that the Army of Northern Virginia has gained its first victory, but Robert E. Lee's first battlefield victory of his Civil War career has come at a dreadful cost. The Army of Northern Virginia suffers 1,483 men killed, 6,402 wounded, and 108 missing at the Battle of Gaine's Mill. As for the Army of the Potomac, it has suffered 894 killed, 3,114 wounded, and 2,829 captured. The two armies had together put a staggering number of men onto the field, 96,000 including reinforcements, making the Battle of Gaine's Mill, the third of the 7 days' battles, the costliest and largest battle of the Peninsula Campaign. Major General McClellan is fortunate that it is not a great deal worse. Only poor Confederate communications, the stoutness of Sykes' regulars in retreat, the last-minute arrival of 2 of Sumner's brigades, and darkness saves his command from being driven against the Chickahominy River and wiped out before it could cross 4 narrow bridges to safety. Had Jackson attacked when he first arrived, or during A.P. Hill's attack, we would have had an easy victory, comparatively, and would have captured most of Porter's command, wrote Colonel Edward Porter Alexander, the Army of Northern Virginia's Chief of Ordnance. That night, after a day during which he had allowed more than 60,000 Union soldiers to sit idly by south of the river while Porter's lines were being driven in savage fighting, McClellan announces he would do what he had privately already decided to do: abandon the Peninsula Campaign and seek a new base on the James River. Lee closes his message to Davis: "We sleep in the field and shall renew the contest in the morning."